The night the storm hit, the entire mountain looked like it had been swallowed by white smoke. The wind wasn't just blowing. It was howling like something alive, slamming against the wooden walls of the mechanic's small workshop cabin. He had lived up there for years, fixing engines, repairing old machines, and keeping mostly to himself. But even he had never seen a storm this intense. The snow was falling sideways, swirling so thickly that he could barely see the tall pine trees outside his window. Inside the workshop, everything rattled. Metal tools clinked gently on the shelves every time the wind shook the building. The heater in the corner nonstop just to keep the place warm enough for him to breathe comfortably. He kept glancing at it, hoping it wouldn't fail on a night like this. Earlier that day, he had heard strange noises outside something, between a cry and a squeak, but he assumed it was the wind messing with his ears. Storms often played tricks on a person, especially when they were alone. But now, hours later, he heard the same sound again. This time it was clearer. Short, faint cries. Weak, almost like they belonged to something that didn't have much strength left. He lifted his head and listened. The sound came again. He felt a tug inside his chest. It didn't make sense, but he couldn't ignore it. He grabbed his thick coat, pulled his boots on, and opened the door. The wind slammed into him instantly, icy and sharp. Snowflakes hit his face like needles. He wrapped his scarf tighter and stepped into the storm. He followed the faint noise, guided more by instinct than by sight. The snow was so deep, it slowed his steps, forcing him to move carefully. The cries grew a little stronger the further he walked. They sounded afraid, lost, and too soft to belong to anything large. When he reached the edge of the old tool shed behind his workshop, he stopped. Something small moved in the snow near the wall. He knelt down slowly, brushing away the snow with his gloved hands. What he saw made him freeze. Two tiny creatures lay curled together, bodies trembling so hard it almost hurt to watch. Their skin wasn't the usual color of any animal he recognized. It was pale, almost glowing white like fresh snow against moonlight. Their eyes were closed, their breaths shallow. He lifted one very gently. It was lighter than it looked, fragile like a bird. Then he noticed something else. The creatures had small wings. Not feather-smooth skin, folded like they hadn't fully grown yet. Their tails were thin and curled tightly around their bodies. They looked like baby lizards, but far more delicate. And yet they had a presence that felt different, strange, almost unreal. He didn't know what they were, but he knew one thing: they were freezing to death. He didn't even hesitate. He tucked both babies inside his coat, close to his chest, hoping his body heat would help them. He then rushed back through the storm, shielding them from the wind the best he could. Their tiny bodies were ice cold against his skin, and for a moment he feared he might have found them too late. Not once inside the workshop, he shut the door hard behind him. Snow had already collected on his shoulders, and he brushed it off while moving quickly toward the heater. He placed the babies on a pile of old blankets near the warm metal. Their little bodies were barely moving. He turned on extra lights, grabbed more towels, and set them by the babies. He didn't know exactly what he was doing, but he had fixed enough machines in his life to know that when something is failing, you do everything you can before giving up. He warmed his hands, then gently rubbed the babies' backs, trying to bring life back into their tiny muscles. One of them let out a weak sound, almost like it was trying to call for help, but didn't have enough strength. "It's okay," he whispered without even thinking. "You're safe now. Stay with me." He wasn't even sure why he spoke to them like that. Maybe because the workshop felt too quiet. Maybe because he could see how helpless they were. Or maybe because caring for something made him feel less alone. After a few minutes, one of the babies twitched. Its tail uncurled slightly. He leaned closer, watching its chest rise a little deeper with each breath. Relief washed over him, but the other baby still didn't move. It lay too still, too silent. He picked it up gently and held it close to the heater. Its skin was cold, its wings limp. He rubbed its back slowly with his thumb, hoping it would react. Then he noticed something alarming: tiny cracks along its scales, like frostbite marks spreading. He frowned. He had never seen anything like it, but it reminded him of metal pipes that cracked in freezing temperatures. If the heat didn't reach its body quickly, the fragile creature might not survive. He wrapped it in a soft towel, cupped it in both hands, and held it against his chest. The warmth from his body began to surround it. He could feel his heart beat against the creature's small body. It still wasn't moving. "Come on, little one," he whispered, almost pleading. "You fought this far. Don't stop now." Minutes passed, feeling like hours. The storm continued to pound outside, but all his focus remained on the tiny creature in his hands. Then suddenly, he felt a faint movement like a shiver. He held his breath. The creature's tiny mouth opened slightly, letting out a soft, almost silent sound. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It wasn't much, but it was a sign. A small sign of life. He placed both babies together under the warmest lamp he had, adjusting it so the heat didn't become too strong. For a moment, he simply watched them. Their tiny bodies, their strange yet peaceful faces, the way their little wings twitched when they moved. He had repaired broken machines, engines, gearboxes. But nothing he had ever fixed looked as delicate as these two living beings. The storm outside kept getting louder, but inside the workshop, there was a kind of quiet hope. He sat down on a stool near them, rubbing his hands together for warmth. He didn't know what they were, where they came from, or why they were out alone in a storm this deadly. But he did know that if he hadn't gone outside earlier, they wouldn't have survived another hour. He leaned forward, studying them more closely. Their scales glistened faintly in the warm light, white as snow but soft-looking. Their tiny claws were barely formed. One of them opened its eyes a little pinkish red, gentle but alert. It looked at him like it was trying to understand where it was. He felt something shift inside him. He had lived up here alone for years, surrounded by machines that didn't breathe or feel. But now, two small lives depended entirely on him. And strangely, that responsibility didn't scare him. It felt right, like something he was meant to do. The weaker baby slowly opened its eyes too, though only for a second. It was enough. Enough to show it was still fighting. He brought them closer to the heater and checked the fire to make sure it wouldn't die out. He added more wood, adjusted the vents, and glanced at the babies again. They were bundled together under the lamp, breathing slow but steady. He stayed awake through the night, refusing to sleep even for a minute. Every few moments, he checked on them, touching their backs, adjusting the heat, whispering soft words he didn't even know he had inside him. Hours passed. The storm didn't let up, but inside that small workshop, two tiny creatures began their slow fight back to life, guided by the warmth of the one human who refused to let them go. And he had no idea that saving them would change his life forever. The storm outside hadn't stopped. If anything, it seemed to have grown stronger, battering the small cabin with snow and ice that pounded against the windows like tiny hammers. Inside, the mechanic had moved everything he could near the heater. Old blankets, towels, and even jackets were piled together to form a soft, warm nest for the two fragile creatures. He didn't know exactly what they were, but it didn't matter. They were alive, barely, and that was enough to make him act like their guardian. He picked up the slightly stronger baby first. Its tiny wings fluttered weakly against his palms. He could feel the shivers running through its body, the cold that had seeped into every inch of it. The warmth of his hands and the soft blankets seemed to help. Slowly, ever so slowly, it began to respond. Its pinkish-red eyes blinked and focused on him, though it was still too weak to move much. He whispered softly, though he didn't know if they could understand. "It's okay. You're safe now. I've got you." He repeated it again and again, almost like saying it out loud would make it real. The weaker baby, however, still lay nearly motionless. Its small chest barely rose with each breath. The mechanic couldn't stop worrying. He carefully wrapped it in a separate towel and held it close to his own body. He could feel the icy stiffness in its little limbs and wings. It was like holding a bird that had been out in a blizzard. He didn't know if he should feed it or wait. He tried gently humming, thinking that maybe his presence alone would help. Hours passed. The stronger baby began to explore a little, curling its tiny head toward the warmth of the blanket and slowly testing its wings. Every little twitch made the mechanic's heart race. He had repaired broken engines that couldn't start, cars that wouldn't move, machines that seemed lifeless. But nothing compared to this. He was not dealing with metal or oil anymore. These were living, breathing, fragile lives, and one wrong move could cost them everything. He moved to the workbench and grabbed a small lamp. Its soft, steady light bathed the little nest in warmth. He adjusted the lamp so that it was close enough to provide heat, but not too hot to harm them. He then sat on a small stool beside the nest, just watching. Every few minutes, he would reach down and gently stroke the tiny wings and tails, careful not to hurt them. The stronger one began to trust him, nudging closer when he extended his hand. The weaker one, however, remained still, almost as if it had given up. He realized he couldn't leave them alone, even for a moment. Outside, the storm raged, and he couldn't risk going out. He stayed awake through the night, dozing only in tiny moments, waking whenever he thought he heard a sound from the babies. Sometimes he would whisper to them, sometimes just stare. "You're going to be okay. I promise you'll make it." His voice became a rhythm to their recovery. The stronger one began to respond with soft, tiny sounds, almost like a kitten mewing. The next day, the mechanic knew he had to do more. They needed food. He had no idea what to give them, and their species seemed unusual, unlike anything he had seen. He looked through his workshop for anything soft, something that could be carefully offered. He tried a small piece of meat from the freezer, but they weren't interested. He tried drops of warm milk, and the stronger one licked it hesitantly. Encouraged, he continued, carefully feeding them tiny amounts at a time. Slowly, the weaker baby began to show interest. A little twitch here, a tiny lick there. Each small movement made him feel a rush of hope that he also realized they needed movement. Their muscles were stiff from freezing, wings almost useless. Carefully, he lifted them one by one, letting them stretch against his hands. The stronger baby began to flap its wings slightly, testing them, while the weaker one tried to imitate, failing, but trying. The mechanic encouraged them softly, clapping his hands gently whenever they moved even a little. It was exhausting work, but he didn't care. This was more important than anything he had ever done. Time passed, and the two babies slowly began to come alive. Their scales, pale and smooth, started to shimmer faintly in the light. Their eyes became brighter, more alert. The stronger one began exploring the blankets, walking clumsily on tiny clawed feet, flapping its wings to balance itself. The weaker one struggled, but managed to follow, leaning against the blankets for support. It wasn't fast or graceful, but it was progress. The mechanic smiled, feeling a mixture of relief and amazement. He had never imagined that such small lives could be so determined to survive. Every night, he kept them close to him. He would wrap them in towels and hold them against his chest, feeling their small hearts beat. Their warmth became a comfort, not just to them, but to him. The storm continued outside, But inside, the little workshop became a tiny haven. He even started giving them names, though quietly, because he felt that speaking to them personally might help. He called the stronger one Snow because of its brightness, and the weaker one Frost because it had fought through the freezing cold. He didn't know if names mattered to them, but it made him feel connected. He also noticed how intelligent they were. They weren't just responding to warmth and food, they seemed aware of his presence. When he moved around the workshop, they would follow him with their heads, their eyes tracking his every action. They began to make little noises when he approached, soft coos and chirps that seemed like attempts at communication. Every sound made him laugh softly, amazed at how alive and responsive they were. For the first time in years, he felt needed, like his actions truly mattered to someone beyond himself. But there were challenges. Their wings were fragile, and every time they tried to flap too hard, he had to carefully guide them, making sure they didn't injure themselves. Their tiny tails would tangle in blankets, requiring his constant attention. Feeding them was another task. He had to prepare small, soft portions multiple times a day, ensuring they were getting enough energy to keep recovering. It was exhausting work, and there were moments when he worried he might fail. But he never gave up. He refused to let the storm or nature or circumstance defeat them. They had fought to survive this far, and he would not let them down now. As the days passed, the babies' personalities began to emerge. Snow was curious and brave, flapping wings and climbing small piles of blankets, exploring corners of the workshop. Frost was more cautious, following slowly, observing, but always close to him. The mechanic noticed how they interacted, how Snow would nuzzle Frost when it looked frightened. It was the first sign of emotional intelligence he had seen in creatures so small. They weren't just surviving, they were forming bonds, learning, feeling. And he was at the center of it all. He began improvising toys and obstacles to encourage their movement. Pieces of old engine parts, soft metal scraps, even small wooden blocks became tools for their exercise. He watched patiently as they tested themselves, attempting to flap, climb, and balance. Every tiny success brought joy, not just to the babies, but to him. It felt like he was raising them, teaching them the basics of life in a world that had been harsh and unwelcoming. And though they couldn't speak, their eyes, sounds, and movements told him stories every day. Stories of fear, trust, and now, slowly, hope. By the end of the week, Snow and Frost were noticeably stronger. Their wings were firmer, their legs more stable, and their eyes brighter. They no longer shivered constantly, and their responses to warmth and comfort were faster. The mechanic felt a strange pride, not like he had ever felt for a machine he fixed, but a deeper satisfaction that came from saving life. He realized that these two tiny beings had changed him as much as he had changed them. He wasn't alone anymore, and the workshop, once just a place for engines and tools, had become a home. He knew there would be more challenges ahead. The storm hadn't completely passed, and there were still dangers outside that he couldn't control. But for now, he had done the impossible. 2 fragile, frozen lives had survived because he refused to give up. And as he sat in the workshop that evening, with the babies nestled against him, he whispered softly, "You made it. You're safe now. I'll make sure of it." And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. The days after the storm were calmer, but the mountains remained cold, and snow still covered the ground outside like a thick blanket. Inside the workshop, the mechanic noticed a change in the 2 babies. They were no longer just weak, frightened creatures barely clinging to life. They were becoming lively, curious, and increasingly aware of their surroundings. Snow was the first to show it. It would crawl over the blankets, testing its wings, flapping them lightly, and climbing onto small stacks of towels as if exploring the world around it. Frost, though more cautious, followed closely. observing everything Snow did, learning silently, but always keeping one eye on the mechanic, as if asking permission to move forward. The mechanic found himself adjusting his daily routine to match theirs. He would wake early, check on their warmth, prepare soft meals, and set up little exercises to help them strengthen their legs and wings. He learned to be patient in ways he had never imagined. Even a tiny step or a flutter of the wings felt like a major achievement. He would cheer softly when Frost finally tried to balance on a small pile of blankets, careful not to startle it. Snow, meanwhile, would respond with little chirps and quick movements, clearly proud of itself for mastering each small challenge. The mechanic felt a strange joy, like he was raising children, even if they were unlike anything he had ever seen. One morning, he noticed Snow doing something unusual. The little dragon approached him while he was repairing an old engine part and nudged his hand with its tiny snout. Then it climbed gently onto his lap, curling up comfortably as if seeking attention and warmth. The mechanic froze for a moment, unsure if it was safe to let it stay there. But when he looked into its eyes, he saw trust. Pure trust. It was the first clear sign that Snow didn't just recognize him as someone who had saved its life. It saw him as someone it could depend on. He slowly placed his hand on its back, feeling the faint warmth under its pale scales. Snow leaned into his touch, letting out a soft, contented sound. Frost, noticing Snow's behavior, hesitated at first. It watched the mechanic, the surroundings, and Snow with cautious eyes. But after a while, it edged closer, curious but careful, until it too allowed him to touch it. He smiled quietly, amazed at how quickly their bond had formed. These two fragile creatures, saved from near death, were now beginning to connect not just with him, but with each other in ways that were more emotional than instinctual. He realized that these weren't ordinary animals, they were intelligent, aware and capable of emotions he could feel simply by being near them. As days passed, he started noticing more unusual behavior. The dragons began to react to his voice in specific ways. If he hummed softly while moving around the workshop, they would tilt their heads and follow him with their eyes. If he clapped gently or tapped on a surface, they would respond, mimicking small sounds like trying to communicate. Snow was especially eager, hopping lightly on the blankets, trying to flap its wings in rhythm with the sounds. Frost was slower, observing and copying cautiously. It amazed the mechanic how quickly they were learning. He wasn't sure how they understood, but it was clear that they could sense his emotions and respond accordingly. He also began to notice that they had preferences and personalities. Snow loved to explore, always moving, climbing, and testing its wings, while Frost preferred to stay closer to him, seeking comfort and guidance. There were moments when Snow would try something risky, like hopping onto a higher stack of blankets, only to tumble down. Frost would watch carefully, then attempt the same thing more carefully, learning from Snow's mistakes. The mechanic would laugh quietly, amazed at how much like children they were. Each success, each small learning step, became a shared joy. He realized that raising them would require constant attention, patience, and understanding, just like raising any intelligent being. But caring for them was not just about play and learning. Their survival still depended on proper warmth, nutrition, and careful observation. He continued preparing tiny portions of soft food, gradually increasing the amount as their strength grew. He experimented carefully, offering drops of warm milk, soft meat, and small bites of fruits he had stored. Snow would eagerly accept, licking carefully, while Frost remained cautious, testing each offering with hesitation. Sometimes he had to coax Frost gently, guiding it with soft words until it accepted the food. It was slow progress, but it worked. By the end of the week, he noticed that they were gaining strength. Their movements were quicker, their wings stronger, and their reactions sharper. They were beginning to thrive. At night, he kept them close to him, wrapping them in soft blankets and holding them gently against his chest. The workshop was quiet, except for the occasional whistle of the wind outside. He would stroke their small backs, watching as they relaxed in his presence. Sometimes Snow would curl up and rest its head on his arm, while Frost nestled close, leaning into his warmth. These moments of calm, small as they were, gave him a sense of purpose and connection he hadn't felt in years. They weren't just surviving, they were beginning to trust him completely, relying on him for everything. As he spent more time with them, he started noticing their intelligence in ways that surprised him. Snow would try to mimic small movements he made, like tilting its head or tapping the blankets with its claws. Frost would observe quietly, then copy the action in its own time. They seemed to understand patterns, reacting to cues, and even recognizing danger in subtle ways. Once, when a branch outside scratched the window in the wind, they both flinched and turned toward him, looking for reassurance. He realized that they were learning not just from him, but also from their environment. They were aware, responsive, and capable of understanding more than he could have imagined. One afternoon, the mechanic noticed something else remarkable. Snow and Frost began playing together in a way that showed emotion and bonding. Snow would chase small shadows on the blankets, and Frost would follow, trying to catch up. Occasionally, one would bump gently into the other, nudging it, and the other would respond with a soft sound or movement. It was not just play, it was communication, learning, and forming a connection. The mechanic watched quietly, feeling a mix of awe and joy. He realized that he wasn't just caring for creatures. He was part of a growing family, built on trust, survival, and affection. Despite their progress, he knew they were still fragile. Their wings, though stronger, were delicate. Their legs, though improved, were not yet fully stable. He continued to guide them, offering support whenever needed, gently correcting movements and encouraging exploration while keeping them safe. Every day was a careful balance of challenge and protection. He had never had so much responsibility, yet he felt a deep satisfaction in rising to meet it. Each small success, each sign of life and growth, felt like a personal victory. Night after night, the same pattern continued. He would stay awake, checking on them, whispering soft words, and ensuring the heater kept the workshop warm enough. The sound of the wind outside reminded him of the danger they had faced, of how close they had come to being lost. But inside, the three of them had found a rhythm. Snow exploring boldly, Frost cautiously following, and the mechanic providing warmth, food, and guidance. It was a fragile, delicate harmony, but it worked. By the end of the week, he realized that the bond between them had grown deeper than he could have imagined. They trusted him completely, and he had grown to care for them in ways that went beyond simple responsibility. Every glance, every soft sound, every tiny movement was a reminder of the miracle of life he had saved. He had taken two creatures on the edge of death and helped them find strength, confidence, and trust. And in return, they had given him companionship, purpose, and a connection he hadn't realized he needed. He knew the challenges were far from over. They still had a long way to go before they could be independent, and the world outside was still harsh and unpredictable. But for now, he allowed himself to feel proud, content, and deeply connected. Snow and Frost were no longer just babies clinging to life. They were living, learning, and growing. And he, the human mechanic who had found them in the storm, was now their protector, teacher, and friend. Every time he looked at them, he reminded himself that this was only the beginning. Their lives, fragile as they had been, had now become intertwined with his own. He had given them warmth, safety, and care, but they had given him something equally precious: trust, companionship, and a reason to believe in the value of patience, kindness, and perseverance. And as the wind howled outside and the snow continued to pile high, He whispered softly to them, "We'll get through this. Together." The days after snow and frost began to grow stronger were some of the most peaceful the mechanic had ever experienced. The storm had passed for the most part, leaving a thick layer of snow outside that sparkled in the weak sunlight. Inside the workshop, things were quieter. The dragons explored more confidently, climbing on small piles of blankets, flapping their wings, and responding to the mechanic's voice in ways that seemed almost intelligent. He was beginning to feel that everything was finally settling into a rhythm. Or at least, he thought it was. One morning, as he was preparing small pieces of soft food for them, he noticed something unusual near the edge of the cabin. In the snow, there were large footprints. They were deeper and wider than any animal tracks he had seen in the area. At first, he thought it might belong to a wild deer, or maybe even a wolf, but the shape was different. Something about the tracks made him uneasy. He stepped outside, brushing the snow away carefully, examining the prints closer. They seemed to circle the workshop, coming closer to the door before disappearing into the forest. A cold sense of danger ran through him. He knew the babies were still fragile, even after their progress. Snow was exploring near the blankets, hopping and flapping its wings, completely unaware of the world outside. Frost stayed closer to the mechanic, eyes wide, sensing something too. He realized that whatever had left those tracks was watching, and it wasn't just curious, it was deliberate. That night, the tension grew. The wind had picked up again, but this time it was different. Amid the whistling of the cold air, there were soft sounds outside the cabin. Footsteps in the snow, careful and deliberate. A shadow moved past the frosted windows. The mechanic froze, his heart beating faster than it had in years. He gently gathered snow and frost, wrapping them in soft blankets and holding them close to his chest. They made small noises, sensing his tension. He approached the window slowly, peeking through a small crack. There, among the snow and shadows of the trees, he saw it. A tall figure, unlike any human he had ever seen. Its shape was humanoid, but the body was long and thin, with subtle glowing eyes that reflected the faint light. The figure moved carefully, scanning the cabin as if searching for something. The mechanic's mind raced. Could this be someone who wanted to take the dragons? Or was it something even stranger? He backed away from the window quietly, trying not to make a sound. Snow let out a small squeak and fluttered its wings. Frost pressed closer, as if sensing the danger too. The mechanic whispered softly, calming them both. "It's okay. Stay close. Don't be afraid." He knew he couldn't let fear take over. Not for him, not for them. These creatures had already survived so much, and he wasn't about to let them face another threat alone. Hours passed, and the shadow outside did not leave. It circled the cabin, sometimes staying out of sight, sometimes gliding near the walls as if testing the limits. The mechanic realized this was no ordinary animal or human. It was intelligent. It knew how to move silently, how to observe, and it was patient. And most worrying of all, it seemed interested in snow and frost. The thought sent a chill down his spine. The next day, he decided he couldn't wait for the shadow to reveal itself. He prepared for the possibility of confrontation. He cleared a space near the doorway, keeping the dragons in a secure corner with blankets and towels. He grabbed some tools from the workbench, not for attack, but to create barriers, noisemakers, anything that might protect the babies. Snow, curious as always, tried to leave the nest to explore, but he gently nudged it back. "Not now. Stay here," he murmured. Frost stayed close. Understanding the seriousness in his voice, by afternoon, the shadow made its move. It appeared at the edge of the clearing, standing just beyond the line of trees. The mechanic could see it clearly now, tall, thin, humanoid, with skin that seemed to shimmer slightly in the light. Its eyes glowed faintly, and it had long fingers that moved slowly as it studied the cabin. The mechanic felt a strange mixture of fear and fascination. Whatever this was, it was not from the ordinary world. The creatures in his care stirred nervously. Snow clung to the blankets, wings flaring slightly. Frost pressed closer to him, its tiny claws gripping his sleeve. He realized that their instincts had sensed the threat even before he fully understood it. He spoke softly, trying to calm them. "It's okay. I'm here. You're safe with me." Hours went by. The figure did not approach any closer, but it stayed in view, moving quietly among the trees, almost like it was communicating with the wind and snow. The mechanic wondered if it was alone, or if there were others nearby. Every instinct told him that he needed to be prepared, that the safety of Snow and Frost depended on him staying calm and alert. As evening approached, the figure vanished for a short while, and the mechanic breathed a small sigh of relief. He checked on the babies, stroking their backs and adjusting the blankets. Snow was restless, chirping softly, but Frost remained calm, leaning against him. He realized that they had already learned to trust him in ways that went beyond instinct. They didn't just rely on him for warmth or food. They relied on him for protection, guidance, and reassurance. That night, he didn't sleep. He kept the lamp burning, keeping the dragons warm and close. Every sound outside made him tense, every rustle of snow a possible threat. Snow and Frost huddled against him, wings tucked, bodies shaking slightly, not from cold, but from awareness of the world around them. He whispered stories softly, trying to distract them, telling them of warmer days, safe places, and adventures they would have once the danger had passed. Days turned into a tense routine. The shadow, or whatever it was, would appear at different times, always watching, always patient. The mechanic remained vigilant, keeping Snow and Frost close, feeding them, and encouraging them to exercise and strengthen. He realized that this strange visitor wasn't just a threat, it was a test. It was as if the world was reminding him that life, even after surviving the storm, was never truly safe. But he also knew that the dragon's trust in him had grown stronger than ever. They relied on him, and he would not let them down. During one quiet afternoon, while the sun was weak but shining, the figure reappeared at the tree line. This time, it stayed longer, moving carefully toward the cabin without making a sound. The mechanic noticed subtle signs. It seemed to be observing the dragons, watching how they moved, how they reacted to him. It wasn't aggressive yet, but it was clearly interested. He realized that the creatures might be part of something larger, something beyond the world he knew. He felt a strange mixture of fear and responsibility. These two fragile lives had already survived so much, but now there was a new threat, one he couldn't fully understand. And yet, he also felt a deep sense of determination. Snow chirped softly, nudging against his arm, and Frost pressed closer, tiny claws gripping his coat. Their trust in him was absolute. They were ready to follow him, to rely on him, and he knew he couldn't fail. That night, as the wind howled and snow drifted against the cabin walls, he made a decision. He would remain vigilant, no matter how long it took. He would watch, protect, and care for Snow and Frost until they were strong enough to face the world themselves. And if this mysterious figure, or whatever it was, tried to take them, he would be ready. The storm had taught him survival. The dragons had taught him patience and responsibility. And now the unknown was teaching him courage in ways he had never imagined. As he held them close, watching them settle under the warm blankets, he whispered softly, "We'll face this together. Nothing will harm you while I'm here." Snow let out a soft, contented chirp, and Frost curled into his chest, trusting him completely. Outside, the wind raged and shadows moved, but inside there was warmth, safety, and a bond that nothing could break. And for the first time since discovering them in the storm, the mechanic felt that he and the dragons were truly a family, a fragile, brave, and unbreakable family facing a world full of challenges together. The days had grown colder, and the mountains around the cabin were covered in thick, sparkling snow. The mechanic had settled into a careful routine with Snow and Frost, making sure they were fed, warm, and safe. But the mysterious figure he had seen in the tree line hadn't disappeared. It lingered at the edges of the forest, watching silently, almost patiently. The mechanic had grown accustomed to this strange presence, but he still didn't know its intentions. He stayed alert, and Snow and Frost stayed close, their instincts tuned to the slightest sound outside. One afternoon, a sound unlike anything he had ever heard filled the air. It wasn't the wind or the creaking of the cabin. It was a deep hum, low and vibrating, carrying through the forest like a living presence. The mechanic froze, Snow chirping nervously, and Frost pressing against him. He could feel the hairs on his neck standing up. Then, from behind the trees, shapes began to appear, tall, sleek figures, moving gracefully, almost gliding over the snow. They were humanoid, but their movements were fluid, unnatural, and precise. Their eyes glowed softly in the pale light, and their skin shimmered faintly, almost like it reflected the snow around them. The mechanic held his breath, unsure whether to hide or to step forward. He kept the dragons close, whispering softly, "It's okay. Stay calm. I've got you." Snow and Frost pressed against him, tiny bodies trembling slightly, but trusting him completely. The figures stopped a short distance away, observing. Then, one of them stepped forward slowly, raising a hand in a gesture that seemed peaceful, almost respectful. A voice echoed in his mind, not spoken aloud, but clear, calm, and strange. "Do not be afraid. We mean no harm. Your care saved them." The mechanic's eyes widened. He had never heard a voice like this before, not from any human. It was calm, deliberate, almost soothing. Snow chirped softly, and Frost made a tiny squeak, responding in ways the mechanic didn't fully understand. The figures moved closer, and for the first time, he noticed details. They were taller than any human, lean and long-limbed, with hands that seemed delicate but strong. Their eyes were large, intelligent, and shimmering with emotion he couldn't name. They were observing Snow and Frost carefully, their attention entirely on the dragons. The mechanic realized they were not ordinary beings, they were something else. Something alien. The tallest one spoke again, and this time he could hear it more clearly, as if the words were carried directly into his mind. "These are our children. They were lost in the storm. We searched for them, but they were too weak. You found them first. You kept them alive." The mechanic felt his heart race. He had known the dragons were special, but this was something he had never imagined. They weren't just unusual creatures. They belonged to an entirely different species, one that clearly understood the dragons and valued them deeply. Snow chirped and flapped its tiny wings. It seemed to recognize something in the figures, something familiar, yet it did not leave the mechanic's side. Frost pressed closer, tiny claws gripping the blanket he held, refusing to move toward the newcomers. The mechanic realized that the bond he had formed with them was strong. They trusted him above all else, and he knew that no matter what these figures wanted, he could not let them go without understanding. One of the figures stepped closer, lowering its glowing eyes to meet his. "Your care has earned trust. They know you saved them. They will not leave your side willingly." The mechanic nodded slowly, still holding the dragons. He had spent days, weeks even, nursing them back to life. He had kept them warm, fed them, guided them through their first weak steps. They had survived because of him, and he wasn't about to give up on that bond now. The tallest figure gestured to the others, and suddenly, The forest around the cabin seemed to come alive. More figures appeared, moving silently, observing, their eyes shimmering. They were not hostile. They did not make a threatening move, but the presence was overwhelming. The mechanic could feel the intelligence radiating from them, the understanding, the emotion. They were cautious, respectful, and clearly concerned for the dragons. Then, the tallest one spoke again, this time aloud, though the words were still soft and deliberate. "We are their family. You have cared for them when we could not. You have shown compassion, courage, and patience. For that, we are grateful." The mechanic swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. He had never expected gratitude from beings like this. He had only done what he thought was right, saved lives, nurtured them, and protected them. Yet here, they recognized it in a way that left him speechless. Snow chirped again, wings fluttering and nudged against his arm. Frost squeaked softly, leaning into him. The mechanic realized they were communicating with him silently, telling him not to let go. These creatures, his small dragons, had formed a deep bond with him, one that even their alien parents could not break. The figures seemed to understand, their eyes softening as they watched the interaction. "They trust you," the tallest figure said, almost as if reading his thoughts. "They remember the warmth, the care, the protection. They will follow their instincts. You have given them life when they had none." The mechanic felt a lump in his throat. He had never imagined his small acts of care would be recognized in this way. He had simply acted out of instinct, out of a desire to save them. But now, facing the truth, he understood the magnitude of what he had done. The figures stepped closer, careful not to startle the dragons. Snow and Frost remained in his hold, watching the newcomers, but refusing to move without him. The mechanic realized that this was a test not of strength, but of trust. The aliens were observing the bond, understanding that it could not be broken easily. Snow chirped again, nudging his hand. Frost pressed its head against his chest. They were telling him, silently, that they chose him. The tallest figure nodded slowly, as if confirming something. "We see the bond. It is rare, precious. They will not leave willingly. You have earned their trust, and that trust cannot be taken lightly." The mechanic nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. These dragons were not just fragile creatures. They were beings of intelligence, emotion, and connection. He had been their protector through the storm, and now, through this encounter, he understood that his role was even more significant than he had imagined. The figures lingered for a while, observing, communicating silently among themselves. Then, finally, the tallest one spoke again. "We came searching for them. We found you first. Your care has saved them. You will continue to guide them, as their trust has chosen you. Know that we are grateful." With that, the figures began to withdraw, moving silently back into the forest. The wind carried their shapes away, leaving the mechanic and the dragons alone in the quiet, snow-covered clearing. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. Snow chirped softly, flapping its wings with small, happy movements. Frost pressed closer, squeaking in a tiny, relieved sound. The mechanic smiled, holding them close. He realized that this encounter had changed everything. These creatures were not just his responsibility. They were a part of something greater, something beyond his understanding. And yet, he had earned their trust. He had earned the trust of the dragons themselves. That night, he stayed awake with them, wrapping them in blankets, holding them close, and whispering softly. He thought about the figures he had seen, their glowing eyes, and the words that had been communicated directly into his mind. He realized that he had been chosen, in a sense, by both the dragons and their alien parents. He had shown courage, patience, and compassion, and now he was part of something far larger than himself, Snow and Frost rested against him, their tiny wings folded, breathing slowly and peacefully. The mechanic stared out at the snow-covered mountains, thinking about what had happened. The world he had known, the world of engines, machines, and solitude, had expanded into something extraordinary. He had saved lives, nurtured trust, and now faced a reality that was beyond anything he could have imagined. And he knew that this was only the beginning. The bond he shared with Snow and Frost was unbreakable. No matter the storms, no matter the unknown figures or the challenges ahead, he knew that they would face it together. The dragons had chosen him, trusted him, and now, in return, he would guide them, protect them, and care for them as long as it took. And in that quiet, snow-covered workshop, with the dragons nestled safely against him, he realized something profound. Life had a way of connecting souls in ways that could not be explained, and he had been part of one of the most extraordinary connections imaginable. The days after the aliens appeared were quiet, but the mechanic couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. Snow and Frost had grown stronger, their movements confident, their tiny wings flapping more deliberately, their eyes brighter and sharper than ever before. The bond between him and the dragons had become unbreakable. They trusted him completely, and he had become their protector in a way that went beyond instinct. Yet, he knew that the alien parents were still out there, watching, waiting. Their presence was subtle, but he could sense it whenever he stepped outside or looked at the snow-covered tree line. He had been alone for years in this cabin, surviving in solitude, but now his life had become a shared responsibility. These creatures relied on him not only for warmth and food, but for guidance, for care, and for protection. And he knew the day would come when the aliens would return, not just to observe, but to reclaim their children. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, the air shifted. The wind carried a familiar hum, low and vibrating, just like the first time the figures had appeared. Snow chirped softly, alerting him, while Frost pressed against his chest. He could feel their small hearts beating rapidly. He wrapped them in a blanket and held them close, whispering, "Stay calm. I'm here. Nothing will harm you." They responded to his voice immediately, trusting him completely, ready to follow his lead. The aliens appeared again, stepping into the clearing slowly. This time, there were more of them, surrounding the cabin at a distance, but close enough that their presence could not be ignored. They moved gracefully, their glowing eyes studying the dragons and the mechanic carefully. He could sense the intelligence radiating from them, their understanding of the world and their children. But now there was a quiet expectation in the air, as if they were waiting for a decision. The tallest figure stepped forward, lowering its glowing eyes to meet his. "You have cared for them. You have kept them alive when we could not. We acknowledge your role, and we respect it. But the time has come for a choice." The mechanic felt a lump in his throat. He had known this moment might come, but it was different than he had imagined. He had grown attached to Snow and Frost. He had nurtured them, taught them, and loved them. To let them go would be devastating. "They are yours," the figure continued. "You may continue to guide them, but they belong to our world. They need to learn, to grow, to live among their own kind. You have given them life, but they cannot stay here forever." The mechanic's mind raced. He understood logically that the dragons had a family, a species, and a world beyond the mountains. But his heart and the bond they shared screamed that he could not let them go, not yet. Snow chirped softly, nudging his hand. Frost pressed against his chest, tiny claws gripping him. They were speaking in the only way they could, telling him to stay close, to protect them, to not let go. And yet, he could sense the pull of the alien parents, the call of their world, the life that awaited them outside the small, snow-covered cabin. The tallest figure spoke again, voice calm but insistent. "We do not wish to take them by force. They will choose as they have learned from you. But their time with you cannot last forever. You have given them survival, strength, and trust. Now they must decide their path." The mechanic understood. He could not decide for them. They had learned to trust, to choose, to act on instinct. And if he tried to force them to stay, it could break that trust, undo everything he had worked so hard to protect. He knelt down, holding Snow and Frost carefully, looking into their bright, intelligent eyes. "It's okay," he whispered. "I won't make you choose. I'll be with you, no matter what. But you have to decide your own path." Snow chirped softly, flapping its wings in a small, eager motion. Frost pressed against him, eyes wide but calm, as if understanding the moment was important. The mechanic realized that the dragons were capable of making this choice, just as he had been capable of saving them. The aliens stepped closer, their glowing eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and patience. They extended their hands slightly, an invitation rather than a command. Snow fluttered its wings, rising slightly into the air. Frost followed, moving closer to the aliens, but still keeping one eye on the mechanic. The mechanic's heart ached, but he understood that this was the natural order. He had given them life, warmth, and safety. Now it was time to let them grow, even if it meant letting them go. He whispered one last time, holding them close. "Go, live, explore your world. But know that I will always be here if you need me." Snow chirped loudly, wings flapping, and nudged toward the aliens. Frost hesitated, looking at him, then nudged forward as well. The mechanic felt tears sting his eyes. He had raised them, cared for them, loved them in ways he hadn't thought possible. And now he was letting them leave not because he wanted to, but because he knew it was the right thing. The aliens accepted the dragons gently, their hands glowing faintly as they guided them into the snowy clearing. Snow and Frost chirped, squeaked, and flapped their wings, responding to the presence of their own kind. The mechanic watched, heart heavy but filled with pride. They had survived the storm, grown strong under his care, and now they were returning to a family that would nurture them further. He realized that love sometimes meant letting go, even when it hurt. For a long moment, the snow-covered clearing was quiet. The aliens nodded to the mechanic, a gesture of respect and gratitude. "You saved them. You gave them trust and strength. That will never be forgotten." The mechanic nodded, unable to speak. He had learned that the bond they shared could not be broken by distance or time. He had saved them once, and in their memories, he would always remain a part of their world. Snow and Frost chirped one last time, flapping their wings in small circles before rising higher into the sky. The aliens guided them gently, helping them ascend, and then, as if in a dream, they disappeared into the distance, leaving the mountains and the snow-covered cabin behind. The mechanic stood alone, watching the empty sky, heart aching yet full. He realized that he had done something extraordinary. He had saved lives, nurtured trust, and now witnessed the beginning of a new journey for the dragons he had loved. He walked back into the cabin, closing the door gently. The wind howled outside, but inside there was warmth, peace, and a sense of fulfillment. The dragons were gone, but their trust, their energy, and their presence had left an imprint on his life that could never be erased. He realized that saving them had changed him. It had shown him courage, patience, and the strength of bonds that transcended species, worlds, and understanding. For days after, he would glance out at the tree line, imagining Snow and Frost exploring their world, learning, growing, and thriving. The mountains remained quiet, the snow still sparkling in the sunlight. But in his heart, he carried the memory of two tiny lives that had survived impossible odds. nurtured by him, and now returning to the world they belonged to. He had been their guardian, and in doing so, had discovered a part of himself he hadn't known existed, a capacity for love, care, and courage that could withstand any storm out in the evenings. He would sit by the heater, imagining their tiny wings flapping, their soft chirps filling the cabin, and he would smile quietly. He knew that life would go on, that the dragons would grow strong, and that one day, perhaps, they would return not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The bond they shared was unbreakable, formed in survival, trust, and love. And he knew, deep in his heart, that the world had been forever changed by their encounter. The storm had taken them to him. He had given them warmth, care, and guidance. And now, as they embarked on the next chapter of their lives, he understood the true meaning of what it meant to save a life. It wasn't just about protection. It was about trust, love, and the courage to let go when the time came. He had done that, and in return, he had been given a gift greater than anything he could have imagined, the knowledge that he had made a difference, that two fragile lives had survived, thrived, and were now ready to face the world, carrying a piece of him with them forever. The snow fell quietly outside the cabin that night, soft and steady. The mountains were silent. The mechanic leaned back, breathing slowly, feeling a deep sense of peace. Snow and frost were out there, alive, strong, and free. He had done his part, and though the world would continue, and storms might come again, he knew that the bond he had shared with them would never fade. He had saved them, and in doing so, had found a courage, a love, and a sense of purpose that would remain with him always.